we will start with Geopandas today, and also coordinate reference systems, and introduce you to that. So let me head over to the course web pages here. I hope you can see this now. So yes, basically today we will start using Geopandas, which builds upon the pandas library that you have been using before in GeoPython. And we will go through how to read and write spatial data from common file formats used in GIS. And we will also do some simple analysis, both spatial and non-spatial. And then we will get into coordinate reference systems and how to project and reproject data for that. Yes. To begin with, we can start with the key concepts for this week. In today's lesson, we will be using different file formats that are common in the GIS world. So shape files will, for those of you who have experience with GIS, that will be common for you. So that is a file format that is used, developed and used by Esri and Esri software like ArcMap and ArcGIS. So within the shapefile, there are or shapefiles are not just one file. There are usually at least 3 files that are needed for the shapefile in order for it to work. So they have different endings or file names, like .shp for the shape, .shx and .dvf that contains the attribute table and projection information. Yes, and then we will also be touching upon GeoPackage, which is a newer format that is common to use. That is, I would say, more efficient to use. It contains all the information in one file, so easier to manage as well. We will also be talking about CRS, or coordinate reference systems. So as last week, we worked mainly in this arbitrary reference system, or where the data didn't necessarily represent something on Earth, but by using a coordinate reference system, we can place the data in a geographic sets. So using longitude and latitude, and project our data to a flat surface that represents locations on Earth. So we'll be doing that, and together with that, we'll also be talking about datums and EPSG. So we will talk more about that later, but they are all both related to coordinate reference systems and how we operate with them. Okay. I will then go to the first notebook of today, which is vector data input and output in Python. So you have already experienced reading in some data formats like CSV files and text files, but today we will be reading other kinds of file formats that contain geographic information. And in that sense, we will be using Geopandas and Fiona, the Fiona module that is behind, that works in the background of Geopandas. So in this notebook, I'm not going to run it, but this notebook kind of works like a reference guide for you if you need to go back to see, okay, how I have this file format, how can I read and write to that? So if we import Geopandas as with the naming convention that we know from pandas, which we usually import as PD. And the normal thing for Geopandas is to import it as GPD as a shorthand. And if we check out with this command here, check out the drivers that enable us to read and write different file formats, we can get a list of the different file formats that Fiona supports. So here there will be some familiar to you, CSV, for example, and S3 shape files, and then GeoJSON and map info and others that you might know from before. So yeah, here is in a way a list of all the different file formats and how we can read and write the data using that. Yes, so as I said, I'm not running this now because I will show you how we do it also in the later today, but here is kind of a reference guide for you if you need to go back. And then first of all, we have the different file formats if you're working with files, but also if you are interacting with databases that contain geographic information, you can do that with a few different ways and different packages in Python. So PostGIS is a very common and fast and efficient way to store and interact with geographic data that I use myself quite a lot too. So here is how you define the credentials that you would be using to interact with a database, and then writing SQL commands to read the data as well. Yes, and there are other ways to do as well. Other types of ways to store data that you might encounter in the future. For example, web feature services is a popular way to store geographic data as well. And so here in this cell is a way to retrieve data from a web feature service from the statistics Finland that will read in data on different municipality levels in Finland. Yes, that you can have a look at if you will be working with that later on. Okay, that was a bit quick, but this was more as a reference guide for you later on. But I will now go over to the first coding lecture today. So I'll head over to Jupyter Lab in my AutoGIS instance and head over into AutoGIS notebooks, lesson 2, and Geopandas basics. Let me zoom in a little bit and we can go. Okay, so today we will be digging deep into Geopandas, how to read data into that from different file paths and writing spatial data from that after doing some geometry calculations on the data that we read into Geopandas. So in brief, Geopandas is very similar to pandas that you are familiar with. It's in a way an extension of pandas. It is built on the same core idea. We have a series of data and data frames, but in Geopandas they are called geo series and geo data frames. So that means that what we have learned about pandas we can take with us into working with Geopandas. And you can also check out the GeoPython lessons on pandas from the link here if you need to. But the main difference from a pandas data frame to a Geopandas data frame is that we have a column that is usually and by default named geometry, that is storing our points or lines or polygons or multi-polygons, and that is in our geodata frame. And from that geometry column, we can do all kinds of geometric operations. We can calculate areas, we can do intersections and unions, and we can calculate different geometric operations on that. We will be doing that today. So yes, the first coding cell here is to import Geopandas. And as I mentioned, we do that in the same, or we usually do that in the same way that we import pandas. So import Geopandas as PD. So yes, if we run that, we have loaded Geopandas as GPD, and we have it in the correct way as well. So we just start with doing that so that we have Geopandas ready when we're using it later on. But first of all, we will need some data that we will be reading into our geodata frames. And so today we will be working with data from the National Land Survey of Finland and their topographic database. Yeah, and you can read more about the data set on the National Land Survey website, and you can also download an Excel sheet that describes the structure of the data. But we will start by, I'll start by just describing shortly what the data we are using today is. So we are taking data from the Helsinki region in Finland that will download from the CSC Open Data Portal. And that data set contains data on different landscape and terrain objects that the Land Survey has created. And we will be interested in all the data that is in a group of terrain objects, and we want to retrieve that data and then separate them into different files based on their feature classes. All right, and so as you see here, here's a description of all the different classes that are in this feature group in the database. So these are all relating to landscape and terrain. So we have fields and parks and lakes that are all classified in different classes. So we'll be going into how we can separate those into different files based on their class. Yes. So in the naming convention of the data set, all the files that we will download that start with the letter M and end with P contains the objects that are of our interest today. So just keep that in mind. But then we will get started downloading the data that we will be using. So if you're working on your own laptop, you can click the link and start downloading the zip file. But in the CSC notebooks, I will open up a terminal. So up here in File and Terminal, it will open here. I'll drag it down so we can see the commands that we're typing as well. So we will be using this as an opportunity to get familiar with writing commands in the terminal as well. So first of all, we want to make sure that we download our data into the correct folder or directory on our instance. So in the terminal down here, if I type ls, that will list everything that is in the directory that I'm in right now. So you can see here, the last thing here is work, it says work. That's the directory we're in now. And it listed all these different files here. So if we go up to the beginning here, that corresponds to these folders and files. So in order to change directory or change folder, the command is cd, and then we want to head over to AutoGIS, press enter. Now you can see it says work/AutoGIS. That means we're in the AutoGIS folder. We can double check that by ls. And then we want to cd again to notebooks, and you can use tab to autocomplete if you want. And then again into the L2 directory. All right, so if we run ls, we can see we are indeed in the correct directory. So then we are going to use a command called wget to download the data. So I will just copy this with Control C and then Shift right click and then paste here in the terminal. That will, if I run that, it downloads the data. It goes rather fast here. Yes, so now the data should be downloaded to our folder. We can indeed see here on the left side, we have a file, a zip file. And in order to unzip that, we type unzip and then the name of that folder, L2, tab to autocomplete, and then enter. And then we see it is running and has unzipped, extracted a lot of files into a folder called L2 data. So if we list out L2 data, we can see it downloaded, it extracted a bunch of files here. If we go into the folder like this, all the National Land Survey data is in the NLS folder. And then there's like a folder structure all the way down here that takes us to a folder with a bunch of files that the Land Survey has created. All right, so I think it would be a good idea to, if everyone that has been able to download the data and sees the similar file path, can use their reactions and give a green check mark, just to make sure that we are on the same page. So I see one red check mark. And if you're having problems, either type in the chat where the problem is or ask from Brian. I can, of course, repeat the unzip step. So I'll just clear the terminal here. So if you have downloaded the data in your notebook L2 folder, you can see L2 underscore data.zip. You can simply write unzip L2 underscore data.zip and run that cell. Yes, when you, there's a question about the changing of directories. So when you change directory, just make sure that it's CD for change directory, then a space, and then the folder that you want to change into. So for this instance, for example, I can see we have a L2 data folder. So CD space L2 data and enter, then I'm in the L2 data folder. And if you want to go up a level in the terminal, you can use CD and then 2 dots or 2 punctuations, then you go 1 level up in the directory folders. So yes, we are done with the terminal for now, and we can step back into the notebook. So what we will be doing now, in order to, if we go back in the folder structure of the data we downloaded, we can see that there are a lot of different folders and a large bunch of files that we will be using. So if we see the extensions here as well, we see that some are .shape and some are .prj for projections and dbf. So we will be trying to automate how we interact with these files, how we can read how we can automate reading the files and writing, eventually also writing the files later on. So for that, we will be using the OS module that we briefly introduced in GeoPython as well. So in order to do that, we import OS, which is a module that allows us to operate with the operating system, and also to manipulate and modify file paths as we go along. So what we first want to do is define the path to our folder. And in order to do that, we could either kind of go back and type every folder in our folder structure, or we could try to right click on a file in that final folder and click copy path to get that path instantly. So here I will be defining the input folder as that will be a string, and we will be using R in before the double quotations to make sure that it reads it as we type it, and then we'll paste the path that we copied in here. So as you can see now, it copied the full path of our file, and we will in fact be as this notebook is in the L2 folder of our notebooks in the AutoGIS folder. In order to make this a relative path instead of the full path, we can get rid of the first part of the path so that we start with L2 data. If we go back up to the notebooks L2, so we're in the L2 folder. Here is where the notebook that we're working on is in. So relative to the position of this notebook within the L data folder, and then all the way down to the shape file here in the end. So in order to make sure that this is just the folder and not the specific file, I will be cutting out this last name of the file and removing the last slash. And then in the and we want to then define the file path for this instance, that we want to read into a data frame later on. So here we use the OS module. So OS, and then OS has a function called path, and then join. Then we can join different strings to make a path that we can interact with. And we do that simply by first giving it the parameter of the folder that we want. So input folder that we created just above. and then the name of the file, the specific file here in the end. And if we then try to print out the file path, the FP, we can see that we get the file path to the specific file that we defined here above. Okay, I hope that was understandable. We will be doing more reading and file path joining, so we will get the opportunity to repeat that as well. But we will then start with trying to read this shapefile into a Geopandas data frame. So yeah, if you haven't read in or imported Geopandas, we can just make sure we do that. Import Geopandas as GPD. And then we will create a variable called data and use and read that in with Geopandas. And that is the function for that in Geopandas is simply read file and then passing it the file path. So if we run that, Geopandas reads the file and we can check the type of data, the data variable, and we can see that it has read in a Geopandas data frame, geodata frame. Yes, so we can try to investigate what the geodata frame looks like when we have read that in. So we can, in the same way that we do with pandas data frames, we can use the data.head to get the first rows of our data. If we run that, we see it has read in a lot of data or that our data has 21 columns. And in the end here, it has a geometry column with shapely polygon objects. Yes, and then we can also check out the different names of our columns to get them in a more easy to read manner. So if we type data.columns values, we should get an array of all the different column names that our geodata frame has. And what we want to do is we are only interested in the group and class of our data together with the geometry of it. So first of all, we will subset our data to make sure that to make it smaller and easier to use. And one simple way to do that is to take this array and copy all the names of the columns. We will paste it in here. And one easy way to do here is that we don't want all the columns, or we don't want to use all the columns, so we can delete the ones that we don't want from this list. So what we are interested in, I'll just delete the first column here, and we are interested in the Rima and Loka columns of the data. So everything else except from the geometry that we also want, we can delete here. Make sure that it's a list. Yes. Yeah, there was a question about the file path. Let me just scroll up to show it again up here. Here you can see the file path, and also you could go into the folder structure, into the last folder here, and then as the naming convention that I mentioned earlier is the files that begin with an M and end with a P. If we locate one of those files here, we can copy the path and then easily easily paste it in here as well. All right, I'll continue where I left off. So we copied the array, the list in the array, and got rid of the columns that we don't want to use. And then we will subset our data geodata frame called data in a new data, or do it by assigning just a subset of our already existing geodata frame by passing a list of the columns that we want to use. So if we run this cell, data equals data, and then within square brackets, a list of the columns we want to use. If we run that, I can also print the data.head just to see that we have only now in our geodata frame only the 3 columns. And then we can also rename the columns that we have so that I don't have to mispronounce the Finnish name. So if we define I'll copy the list of columns here. The geometry column we want to keep the same. So for these two, we will create a dictionary. So as you maybe remember, the dictionary is written using curly brackets. So one curly open there, and then one in the end. And then how we define the new names is having the old name, a colon, and then the new name. So for Rima, we can have group, and for Loka, colon, class. And we'll store those in a dictionary called call names, like this. So run that. We have a dictionary with the new names, and in order to apply that to our geodata frame, we run data and then rename columns equals call names, and in place equals true. This we have also done in the GeoPython course, so that should be familiar to most of you. So we can just check that it did in fact work by running data.head, and we can see now we have group and class and geometry. Yes, and we can even see if we, for example, wanted to print out the data, we can see that here we have the group is the same for all the 4,000 rows, or at least the first and the last. So, but the class changes for the difference. So what we are interested in is that we want to take from all the features from this group and divide them into the according classes. Okay, then now is a time for you to check your understanding. So what I would like you to do is to figure out from the geodata frame that we just created how many rows we have, how many different classes, and how many different groups there are in our geodata frame. So I'll clear the check marks that we have, and then I'll give you 5-6 minutes to try to figure out how many rows, how many classes, and how many groups we have in our geodata frame, and I'll go through that after 5 minutes. All right, and then yeah, use your check marks when you are done. Okay, so I see a lot of green check marks, so that is good. I will go ahead and show you at least one way you can do it. So what we wanted to figure out was the number of rows. And as you can see, we already actually have that data by, or that information by printing data, but we could also do it by, say, printing out, and use an F string. We can print out the number of rows, and that is the length of our data, geodata frame. And then in order to then see, we could print for the classes, we could also print the number of classes would be, in order to yeah, in order to find the number of classes, there's a typo there, we can use the data, and we are only interested in the class. And we can use the number of unique functions, and unique. So typing that, and we can do the same thing for groups by accessing the group column. So if we run those, we would get 4,311 rows. That's the same as we saw above here. Classes, just one, which is good. We were only interested in one class. I forgot to, no, group, sorry. Only one group, which is correct. And then there are 20 different classes in our data set. So that is one way to find that information. All right, so once we have gotten to know our geodata frame, another way we can get familiar with it is also to easily plot the data to get a quick overview of what it looks like. And with geodata frames, we can do it in the same way that we did with pandas. So if we were to write data.plot, that would use the matplotlib library to just plot, quickly make a plot of our data. So there you go. We plotted our geodata frame. Yeah, so as of now, if you are not very familiar with Helsinki, the Helsinki area, this might not tell you that much, but at least it shows us that we have a bunch of different polygons with in our data set, and we know that they are different classes that we can use later on to either visualize or do specific operations for each of the different classes. So that's just one quick way to also get familiar with the data set that you're working in. Okay, let's move on to some geometries within Geopandas. So as we talked about, the core feature of geodata frames is the geometry column that stores shapely objects. So let's take a look at that first. We'll print out the data geometry column, get the first 5 rows with the head function, and we see that we have a bunch of polygons that are shapely polygon objects. So that tells us that we can use different shapely methods to interact with those polygons. So let's first try to check out the first polygon in our data. We can, if we type data.at, we select which row we want to work with, and in our instance at index 0, and the geometry column. If we run this, we can see that it plots the shapely object like we saw last week as a polygon. So that is good. We then know that the geometry column indeed contains shapely objects. Yes. So another thing we can do with that, when we know it's a shapely object, we can use the different methods that we talked about last week. And one of them is to calculate the area of the polygon. So if we try to do that for the first polygon in our data set, we can let us turn this into an F string here. So the area is, and what we want to access is the data. We'll do the same. Let's just copy this here, the data at the first index and that area. And that will print out the area in square meters of our first polygon. We can even, if we want to make that easier to read, we can round it off with 0 decimals. And we see that our area is 76 square meters. Yes, so that shows us we can easily use the shapely methods that we've already learned in a geodata frame. So we can also do that in a for loop. So here, if we using the iteros functions that you know, we can, if we just run this cell, that should print out the area of each polygon for the first 5 rows of our data. So you can see that it calculates for each of the polygons. Yes. But one of the main features of Geopandas is that some of these features, that like interacting with shapely objects, is already built in to our geodata frame. So in fact, it's not really necessary to go through this iteros process or doing it in a for loop. We can do it quite easily, accessing the different attributes of our geometries. So if we, for example, just in this next cell, type data.area and run that, we can see it calculates the area of each of the polygons in our data frame already. So that's one of the advantages of using geodata frames. It does it really quickly and easily. And if we would want to, we could add that area information into a new column in our data frame to store it and use it later on. So for example, if we create a new column in our geodata frame called area and assign that with data.area, run that, and then we could see data, for example, data.head. We can see we have now a new column in the end called area that contains the area information of our geometries. And in that sense, it has quickly built that information for us, and we can do other operations like the min and max and average values that we have used earlier. So for example, if we would find the max values of our, or the largest polygon in our data, we could, let's round that data from the beginning. We could take data or the area column of our data, use the max function, let's round it to 2 decimal points, and quickly find our largest polygon. And we can do that the same with replacing it with the min function and also with our average size of polygons. So just quickly recap what I just showed. We can with Geopandas quickly get the attributes that our geometry column contains, like the area here. We got the area from all the different polygons, created that into a new column, quickly extracted that area information into the new column, and then added that to our data frame. Okay, I will have a few cells to run, and then we have a check your understanding. So then we can also use that to catch up a little bit if someone is missing something. You can write that to chat. But we'll first just give an example of how to take the data that we have and writing data to a shape file. So with geo data frames, it's quite simple to export the data, just like with pandas, into different files. And with geodata frames, for example, shape files or other geographic file formats can be used. So in this instance, we will select one class in our group. So we're interested in the lake water class here. So in order to do that, we can make a selection of our data. We'll subset our data to a variable called selection. Use the geodata frame we have, and using the lock function, we can access just the data that that is true to the attribute that we pass it here in the lock function. So here we want to select the from our data frame where the class column equals 2, and then we'll use the class number. Copy the 36200 here, paste it here, and this selects the data from our data where this condition is true. So class equals 36200. If we run that, it makes a selection. We can try to just quickly, if we, for example, plot it, we can see here. All right, it's selected only, or it plotted only a few of the polygons that we saw earlier. So we know it has indeed made a selection. We could also print selection.head to see, all right, indeed it selects a few rows of our data. They all seem to have the same class, which is good. That was the class that we selected. So if we want to save that to a file, we will select the output folder that we want to use. So in the same way that we did earlier, we have an R string and use we'll just do it in the L2 data folder. If we go up here to our notebooks here, we can see we have the L2 data folder here, which we will use here. And then, as we did earlier with using the OS module, we can use path and join. We'll join with our output folder that we just defined, and also write the name of our file. Let's call it class, the class that it is, 36200, and the shape. That is the file type that we are using. So now we here we define the output folder and the output file path, run that cell, and then we finally want to write that selection to a file. So selection, and the way we do it is just from Geo data frames, it's selection.toFile, and then the file name that we want to use, which we created above, output FP file path. If we run that, then in our L2 data shortly, if we refresh it, we see here our class shapefile that we created. All right. So then we will take 5 to 10 minutes where you can check your understanding of how trying to read in the data that we just created into a geo data frame, and then do some checks to see that the data is good and get some information out of that. So I'll clear the check marks again, and feel free to use the green check marks if you are able to read it in. Just remember which folder we created our data in. Yes, so 5 to 10 minutes, and then I will show a way to that I would do it. And then you can also, if there was something that you missed or that you would want me to repeat, if I was unclear, then write it in the chat and I'll try to answer that and also show it afterwards. Okay. But yes, let me quickly then just read in the data or the shapefile that we created and see how we do that. So we'll write in I'll just use a temporary data variable, and we will use Geopandas, GPD, and read file as we did earlier. And then we have in memory stored the file path in the output FP variable. So we can use that as well if we don't want to type the entire file path. So we can use that, and we can check the head of our new data frame and see here the data that we have. We can also quickly plot it to see that it looks as it should, and it does. So that's a way to check if the data file you have created is correct quickly. Okay, and then we will look into grouping the data frame before taking a short break and starting with projections. So one way to group the data that you are familiar with from GeoPython is the group by function. Now we will automate how to group our data and exporting different files for the different classes in our data frame. So we can quickly check the first rows of our data. We will keep using the geodata frame we created earlier above. So checking the head of our data frame, we see that it's here. We see we have the class column, which is what we're interested in grouping by. So we can first see, to quickly find the different values of our class column, we can access that with using data and then our class column and the unique function. So running that will provide us with the array of the different unique values in our class column of our geodata frame. And then we can go on to use that data to group the geodata frame. So let's create a grouped instance of our data by data.groupby, which is familiar. And then we want to group it by the class column. And then we can print out the grouped object that we see. We have a pandas group by object. So it's similar to what you may know from before. We can also check out the different keys that our group by object has. So we can access that with the grouped groups and then keys function, and then we get a dictionary or the an array of our keys that are in our group by object, and we can see this resembles all the different classes that we saw above here. So that is good. So in order to group our data frame, or split it up in different groups, we can see first try to get some information out of that grouped object. So let's iterate over our grouped object with the keys and the different groups. So to check out some information about the object, we can print out. Say we want to print out the keys that we have. So that is the classes we have. So using an F string, we can see that the terrain classes we have in our data set or in our grouped object is key. Here, it will only be one class per iteration, and then also see how many rows there are in the different groups. So if we see number of rows in our group, we can, by using the length of our group, I'm typing a bit too fast, I can see. All right, then we should be able, if we run this, we see we have in all the different terrain classes, we have the length of them. So we can see here, familiar, this is the lake water class that we used before. We have 56 lake polygons in our data. And as we using a for loop, the last iteration of that is still kept in memory. So if we want to say our group, which is from the last run in our loop, if we check out the head of that, we can see here that that is the terrain class here. It matches up with here. And then we can also see that from this inside this group, the index that we see here, we might have expected it to be 0, as this is the first in this group. But when using the group by function, it keeps the index from the original geodata frame that we grouped by. So we see that even though it's the first row in that group, it has the index 4303. So that is just a good thing to keep in mind, that the index it doesn't reset the index when grouping the data. All right, so we can then just check the type that our last group has to see that it is a geodata frame. So we know that, and then we know that we can also work with the geometries that are in that group. Okay, so now we'll move on to doing the automated saving of different classes in different shapefiles. So there are different ways to define the string or the name of that file name for each class. So here are some different options for that in this box. We will be using the last one here, if I remember correctly. So the format using .format type. So if you want to know more about that, you can read up on in the link here. But for now, we will just continue to be using the so-called positional formatting with the .format function. Okay, but let's move on to creating the different files. So to begin with, we will define the output folder as we have done earlier as well. In the same way, we will do it in the L2 data folder. That is the output folder, and then we want to create a results folder where we will store all our resulting files. We will do that by, again, using OS and then path join function. We will combine the output folder with and call the name of our folder, which we will call results. So running that, we now have a path that we can use when creating our different files. And here we can also just check that if the whether or not the folder already exists. If it does not exist here, then it will create the folder using a function of the OS module called make directories. So now, since it did not exist already, it created the folder for us. If we go into L2 data, we can see it has created a folder. And now we will be creating our different files for the different classes. So here again, in our grouped object that we created earlier, we will iterate over the different groups again, and then create a formatting the file name that we will be using. So our output name, for instance, would be create a string, and here we call it terrain because it's the terrain class, underscore, and then curly brackets, and then use our format function or format way of doing the string. And here we will put key. There are also other ways to do this, but this is the way we will do it in this instance. So here we first create the format for the file name, and then we will, as we run it, we will print out some information to ourselves. So we can create an F string and say, okay, we are saving the file, and then which file it is in the iteration, and we will then do OS, then path, and base name. That will output name. This base name, you will see how that works later on, but it will basically just take the concrete name of the file and not the entire path of the file. So it makes it easier to read for us. And then we need to create the output path, the entire path. So out path, for instance, using os.path and join. And here we are using the result folder that we created above, and output name. And that creates the path that in the end here, we take the grouped data for the instance, and then to file and give it the out path. So if we run this, it will iterate over the grouped object, use the key from the grouped object to give that to the file name, and then we take the whole group, give it that file name and create that file. All right. So if we do that, we see it's saving the different files. And if we check in our results folder, it has populated many different folders with each of the different classes. So that was one way, or that was how you can automate both reading the data, grouping it, and then exporting it to different files. All right. Yes. There's a question that someone is not getting a folder. I am not sure why, but try to double check the formatting of the output path, that it is the result folder that we created above, and then that is the output path. Okay, so there is some extra content here that you could also check if you want to save the data to another file format, or using just different, getting different data. So here, for example, we can just run quickly through it in interest of time. So here we can create from our grouped by object, we can calculate the sum of the area for each of the different classes, and see here that we get get information about each class and how large the area of those classes are, and create a CSV file for that information as well. So there are different ways to get the information to a file.